Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantirme Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, Sarvas sadbuddhimapnoto, sarvas sarvatra nandato. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asato ma satkamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritam gamaya aviravirmayeti rudrayatte takshinam mukham te namam pahi nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Today we begin the study of a small talk that Vivekananda gave at the Parliament of Religions. It's titled here as Buddhism, the Fulfillment of Hinduism. And we see from the context here, it looks like this was some kind of a panel in which representatives of different religions participated. And it looks like Swami Vivekananda was called upon to what he calls here as to criticize. Obviously, there was some Buddhist speaker before him, and it looks like some of the representatives of other religious traditions were called to give their view about what was said about Buddhism. And this is sometimes called the ethic and emic views in religious studies. That is, the understanding, for instance, now you enter a home, the home looks in one way from inside, and then those who have never entered that house, if they see it from outside, you get a different view. Now, to get a complete knowledge of a house, it's good to know how it looks from the inside and how it looks from the outside. So some of us who belong to a certain tradition might have our understanding, our view of the tradition from the inside. Now, those who don't belong to that tradition, but have made an effort to understand it, to know about it, to learn about it, but are not really practicing it from within, they haven't grown up in that tradition, so their view of it would be from an outside. And there is a lot of debate in religious circles about which of these views is better or more important or more accurate. And the truth is that each of these views, the insider view and the outsider view, have something to add to our knowledge. So for those who are insiders in any tradition, it is helpful for them to know how the outsiders see that tradition. And those who try to understand a tradition from the outside, it is helpful for them to know how it feels from the inside. Now, sometimes they have an approach, often called the phenomenological approach. And by that is meant that suppose I want to go to some distant part of the world and try to understand the society there, the culture there, or the religion there. And I'm not a part of that society, I'm not a part of that culture, I'm not a part of that religion. And so I go and try to study it. So that study will be as an outsider. One other way would be to go and interview and speak with the people from inside the tradition and get to understand the tradition not from the inside, but from the perspective of someone who is inside. And yet another way, the phenomenological way would be someone who says, okay, for the next 6 months or a year, I'm going to keep aside my own ideas or about my own belief system and try to understand the world, pretend internally that I'm a part of this tradition and try to see and understand the world as if I were from the inside. Now, we can never really do it perfectly because it is easier to say, or just switch off my present belief system and kind of take upon yourself a new one. But attempts have been made. So complete objectivity, completely studying something in a neutral way, that humanly is not possible. We always have certain pre-existing ideas, notions, values. And no matter what we study, a little of that does come. But these are the different ways. And therefore this tension, if you like, between the insider view and outsider view of a religion has always existed. And what Ramakrishna, Vivekananda have taught is that both of these are important. We will have a better, fuller knowledge if we try to understand something both from the inside as well as from the outside. And so essentially a little bit of that is kind of happening here at the Parliament of Religions. So there were these speakers from different traditions, and the audience was not always from that tradition. So the audience is hearing this speaker, trying to understand it, trying to respond to it as an outsider oftentimes. And so what Vivekananda was called upon to do here was, there was this Buddhist speaker before. And so they said, could you please come now and speak about your response? What is a Hindu understanding of Buddhism as opposed to a Buddhist understanding of Buddhism? So that's essentially what Swamiji is trying to do. And clearly, it's a very short response. So there was time limit. We can see how sometimes we are called upon to speak on profound subjects and in a very short time. If you have been following these debates, primary debates, you have these very profound questions and you have to respond within a minute 10, 15 seconds or a 45 seconds. And it just kind of ends up being just some one-line zingers yeah, it's not possible to speak on these profound subjects in a small time. But anyway, it was clearly more than 1 minute, 15 seconds here. But all that you can see is some of the ideas that were highlighted by Swamiji. And so let's take a look. So this is on page 38. So this was given on 26th of September. And if you see the longer talk paper that we just finished reading, that was given on the 19th of September. So this was just exactly a week after that. I'm not a Buddhist, as you have heard, and yet I am. So just a small little footnote here. Vivekananda, when he first came here, and he was among the first of Eastern religious teachers to come to North America. And he was the first Hindu teacher to come to North America. Until that time, some of the elites, maybe the Boston Brahmins and the Transcendentalists, etc., they had done some reading about the Hindu thought. It's not known whether they had actually personally met any Hindu teacher. And so when these religious teachers from the East, teachers of Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, and others, they first came for this event, all of them had these very colorful robes. And oftentimes, Vivekananda was mistaken to be a Buddhist. Indeed, that tradition still continues. Oftentimes, when I go in my robes, nowadays people mostly understand that this is a religious habit, but still there are people who still mistake it to be a Buddhist monk, because they clearly have a much greater visibility and influence in the Western soil than Hinduism. Hinduism has acquired a different way it is seen than as Buddhists are seen. Anyway, so even I am today, not too often, but sometimes have been mistaken to be a Buddhist teacher. And so Vivekananda was sometimes asked whether he was a Buddhist. But because both the tradition and the word was so new, people didn't even know how to pronounce that word. So they often asked him, "Are you a Buddhist?" And then he would say, "No, ma'am, I'm a florist." So anyway, now most people know the word Buddhism. And so that's how you begin by saying, "I'm not a Buddhist, as you have heard, and yet I am." If China or Japan or Ceylon is the present-day Sri Lanka, follow the teachings of the great master, India worships him as God incarnate on earth. You have just now heard that I am going to criticize Buddhism, but by that I wish you to understand only this. Far be it from me to criticize him whom I worship as God incarnate on earth. But our views about Buddha are that he was not understood properly by his disciples. As Vivekananda, as a young boy, his name was Narendra then, we read in his life that as a child, he often used to, the life says, play at meditation. By that, it's probably, the meant was, here this group of very young boys, and they didn't have computer games in those, so they had to invent their own games. And one of the things that these boys did was, let's sit and meditate. And maybe we don't know how long they sat, but we do read in Vivekananda's life that as a child, he seems to have had this natural inclination towards meditation. So even when it began as a sort of play with his friends, but there were times when he would sit for meditation and get so absorbed in it that he would just remain in that state for a long time. Of course, the friends would just open their eyes and see he's deep, so maybe they would just get up and go somewhere else. But we read about that. In fact, there is an incident in Vivekananda's childhood when he was just sitting in a room um, with closed eyes, and got so deep absorption he entered into that a snake somehow had entered that room. And someone had noticed it in the family, and they ran, but they found he was completely unaware of it. There was all this commotion of a snake and people running to catch it and drive it away, while he remained so deeply absorbed. So later on in life, when he met Ramakrishna, Ramakrishna commented, he said, here is this pure soul who has been adept at meditation right from very young age. And he could see that as soon as he met Narendra. And that is why, and then I mentioned this because his very first vision, a spiritual vision if you like, was that of Buddha. The very first vision as a young child. And he didn't know that time it was even Buddha. In fact, he says that he was just sitting all alone and must have been maybe 7 years old, 8 years old, around that time. He was just sitting, and then his eyes closed, and he suddenly had this very calm, peaceful personality he saw in his meditation. And he was terrified. Just a young child, wasn't trained systematically by any teacher, just meditating on his own. And suddenly he had this vision of someone in this orange robes, peace and calm. He just got up and ran out of that room out of fear. Who is this person suddenly showed up? And then after a while, then he realized, oh no, why did I run away? And he said he just came back into the room, and then he again closed his eyes, but he said he didn't. Obviously, the vision wasn't waiting for him when he came back. And then it took a while for him, and afterwards he realized that that was a vision of the Buddha. And so that's why he had this lifelong devotion to Buddha. And that is why he says here, far be it from me to criticize him whom I worship as God incarnate on earth. But our views about Buddha are that he was not understood properly by his disciples. The relation between Hinduism, by Hinduism I mean the religion of the Vedas, and what is called Buddhism at the present day, is nearly the same as between Judaism and Christianity. Jesus Christ was a Jew and Shakyamuni was a Hindu. So another name for Buddha is Shakyamuni because he belonged to the Shakya clan, the dynastic lineage. The Jews rejected Jesus Christ and they crucified him, and the Hindus have accepted Shakyamuni as God and worship him. But the real difference that we Hindus want to show between modern Buddhism and what we should understand as the teachings of Lord Buddha lies principally in this. Shakyamuni came to preach nothing new. He also, like Jesus, came to fulfill and not to destroy. Only in the case of Jesus, it was the old people, the Jews, who did not understand him, while in the case of Buddha, it was his own followers who did not realize the import of his teachings. As the Jew did not understand the fulfillment of the Old Testament, so the Buddhist did not understand the fulfillment of the truths of the Hindu religion. Again, I repeat, Shakyamuni came not to destroy, but he was the fulfillment, the logical conclusion, the logical development of the religion of the Hindus. Several points here. We, of course, are reminded of what Jesus said, that I come to fulfill and not to destroy. Now, a lot of what Swamiji says here needs a nuance and needs a context. Now, he was not a scholar in Judaism. He clearly knew more about Christianity than Judaism. Jewish community has been in India for centuries. When the sacred temple was destroyed by the Romans. So they have been in India for a long time, but their number has been very small. And they settled mostly in the southern part, the southwestern part of India. There isn't any evidence that Swamiji himself had any close connection with the community. So a lot of what he says here has to be taken as a really long outside view, not of someone who has studied Judaism in its nuances. I say that because the statement that Jews rejected Jesus, now crucified him, will shock some people. It's not shock because not necessarily because it is wrong, but it's good to recognize that Jesus himself was a part of the Jewish community. All of his disciples and followers were Jews themselves. So it's not as simple as to say the Jews rejected him. If they rejected him, then he wouldn't have had any followers. So his followers were Jewish. So when it is said they rejected him, what Swamiji means is the orthodoxy of his time, the orthodox among the community in which he was born, they were not open to this, what they saw as a new and radical departure from the traditions that they had held on to for centuries before. And this is again a kind of a tension that we see in all religious tradition. Every reformer, when he or she wants to bring about certain changes, while there are people who are eager to embrace that change, embrace that reform, welcome that reform, there's always the other group, usually what we say are the orthodox, who want to say no, 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 or kind of hold it back. And sometimes we tend to glorify one and demonize the other, but a retrospective view of history shows us that both of these forces are essential. And in our own personal lives, it happens, but we don't call it orthodoxy and liberal and radical. But every person, as we are growing up, will see in the teenage years or sometime around that, in the late teens or early teens, the youth want to try things that are new. And then there'll always, some people in the family will be very encouraging and say, yes, go for it. And then there will be oftentimes the conservative or the orthodox, usually happen to be sometimes your parents or your grandparents. So there will be the older members of the family who'd say, no, 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 you don't, that's not our tradition, this is not how we do things in the family. So we see this kind of a tension occurring not only on a larger scale among religious communities or even social groups. It can happen in family, with family is really the smallest social unit. We can see that there will be members in the family who want to do things differently, and there'll be other members trying to say no and hold them back. And I say that both of these forces of going out and doing something new and applying brakes are necessary. I mean, when you're driving a car, you need both. You need the brakes to apply, and you need accelerator. You need a car to go fast. And we know we need to apply both these in a right way in order for us to navigate our way through life. Because if we just say, I'm just going to now push gas and not apply brakes at all, that may not be good. But if I say, I'm just going to apply brakes, then I'm not going to move at all. So we need both. And so just as that makes sense, in a larger sense also, because sometimes orthodoxies are often seen by liberals as, oh, that's like they never want to try anything new. So that's what I want to say, that there is good in both. Good in the desire to hold on to certain ancient values, and good in this desire to break those old, tired, worn-out habits and try something new. And with this kind of a tension between going forward and holding back, gradually things emerge. So all changes that occur are often very gradual. And it is these gradual changes that stick. Any drastic changes will always have drastic repercussions, drastic reaction. Every action has a reaction. And we see that sometimes in our own lives. If I'm used to waking up at 8 o'clock every morning and I suddenly say, no, this has got to stop. I'm now going to, from tomorrow, I'm going to wake up at 4 o'clock every morning. I mean, that's a great intention. But suddenly, overnight, I'm not going to be able to change that habit if I have a certain way of living for years together. So if I want to bring about a change, then an incremental change always helps. Suppose I want to say, well, I want to get up early. So if I now wake up every morning at 8, I can say, why not push it back by a few minutes and say, let me wake up at 7:30. And if I'm able to do that for a few days, then push it back further. Or a meditation also, for that matter. We can't say, well, today is a holiday, so today I'm going to sit and meditate for 10 hours. Just not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. So again, if I want to meditate longer, then I must say, well, what's my baseline? How much can I meditate on a daily basis? Suppose if I can meditate with concentration and focus for 15 minutes, then I can say, well, if I want to increase that, let me push it to 20 minutes or 25 minutes. That's the way to go forward. And so that's one thing to remember when Swamiji is speaking here about the reform and how Jesus was rejected and so on. And then what he shows the contrast here is that while Jesus was rejected by the Orthodox community of his time, the Buddha was worshipped. Now this took time. Even when the Buddha came as a reformer, there was a reaction. There was certainly a reaction. The orthodoxies among the Hindu community, they were not too happy with this new reform teacher coming and kind of breaking up all old rules. So there was a reaction. The Orthodox did try to hold him back. But the Buddhist tradition and the group that grew around him eventually were very powerful. And the difference is this. I think this is another phenomenon that needs to be kept in mind also. And we saw from this short bit of history that Swamiji gives here, we can say that Jesus was not a Christian. He was a Jewish person. And Buddha was not a Buddhist. Buddha was a Hindu reformer. So all of these founders of religious traditions, if you like, they were reformers of an existing tradition of their time. There isn't any evidence that when Buddha ever said, oh, I'm rejecting Hinduism, this is kind of a new path that I'm giving, and henceforward, this will be called Buddhism. All this is occurred long, long after Buddha. All that the Buddha was doing was, here is a tradition I'm born in, clearly it needs reform, and this is the way to do it. Eventually, what happens is, because these teachers are so charismatic, so powerful, such dynamos of spirituality, they acquire a big following. And that following then acquires an identity of its own. And the more you kind of create that special identity, you are simultaneously saying, I am this, therefore I'm not that. So that's how it occurs. All identity identifies you with one thing, but when you identify with one thing, usually you are disidentifying with a lot of other things that you identified with before. And so when the followers of Buddha first probably saw themselves as, we are Hindus and we follow the Buddha. And at some point then, they said, we are followers of Buddha. And then their earlier identity as Hindus kind of goes to the background. And all of this happens, and they sometimes take generations, 2, 3, 4 generations, when the teachings that were given get more crystallized, become more tangible, become more institutionalized, if you like. By that I mean that Buddha didn't write any books. So it was his disciples who, long after Buddha was gone, who collected his teachings. And that's how the original foundational texts of Buddhism are really the teachings that are collected by his contemporaries and often by generations of disciples after him. So it is like, we heard so-and-so, XYZ said that this is what Buddha had told them, and then someone then notes it down, and then that becomes a text. And so eventually, the group acquires an identity, and that identity then separates itself from the larger. So Christianity, at some point, became said, well, we are Christians now, therefore we are no longer Jews. Or we are Buddhists now, therefore we are no longer Hindus. We are different from them. So that's how these traditions become separate. One of the things that has occurred in the Hindu tradition, that's what the difference that Swamiji is trying to show here is, that just like sometimes if you've gone to the seashore, and sometimes you will see that you go and as children and you play and you build some sand castles, and maybe you forget some of the bucket and some of the things that you had carried with you, some plastic things or toys, maybe you just forget them. And it's just lying on the beach. But later on, when the high tide comes, it just comes and then carries the whole thing again. And next time you go, there isn't anything there. So something like that seems to have happened in the Indian subcontinent. Many reformers have come throughout history, and seemingly they provided new ways of understanding, new ways of looking, new ways of doing things. And it almost seemed like, oh, this is some new branch that is almost now being separated from this big ocean. Oftentimes that ocean gets called as the eternal truth, Sanatana Dharma, that's the Sanskrit word. And so something seems like, well, it's almost like getting out. It's out on the beach. And then the high tide comes, and it just comes and kind of absorbs the whole thing. A little bit of that seems to have happened there. So the Buddha came, amazing teacher, very charismatic, and a group of his followers, they acquired an identity of its own. And then this big ocean comes and takes everything. And how does it end up? So Buddha then becomes one of the many incarnations that the Hindus worship. Because in the Hindu tradition, philosophically, the highest being or the highest truth is seen as beyond form, beyond personalities. Is just beyond all differentiation. But because that highest truth is beyond personalities, all of the personalities, you have a scope to embrace and accept all personalities, because the principle is seen as standing beyond all of them. So there is a acceptance of all personalities, but seeing them as representations of that higher non-personal ideal. And that's why Hindus accept many avatars, many incarnations. And so it becomes easier with that kind of thinking. It becomes easier then to accept all the new reformers, all the new teachers, and then become a part of this large ocean. And so Buddha then became an incarnation who is worshipped. To the extent that today there are parts of this whole, and Swamiji is using the word Hinduism as he clarifies. By that I mean the religion of the Vedas, and what we today call Vedanta. So to the extent that now we say we worship Jesus. So Hindus don't have any difficulty seeing Jesus as one of these incarnations. So just as they were able to embrace the Buddha, they're able to embrace the forms of divinity that have occurred in different points of history in different parts of the world. So that is what he meant by saying that they recognize that, he says, that Shakya Muni came to preach nothing new. He also, like Jesus, came to fulfill and not to destroy. I'll just make one comment and then we can discuss more about this. And that is, there is something in the human heart, this kind of a desire for newness. And it's probably there I think, just in our DNA. So it just shows up in every little thing. Oh, I mean, that's the whole basis of the consumeristic society in which we live. So every time people say, is there anything new? Is there an update? After some time, an app or a gadget becomes old. And I mean, where are you going to produce new gadgets all the time? So essentially, you have these old gadgets with a few minor changes, a new name, a different gloss, a different slightly color, and then you mark it and say, oh, this is the new thing. I mean, think about the millions of iPhones being sold every year. And I mean, how much changes can you make in a rectangle? But that's the way marketing does. Is like, whoa, this is new. And people say, oh, that's old, so let me get a new thing. So there is this kind of a desire for new. And so it's important that when we look at the words of Jesus and look at the words of Buddha and all of these, I came to fulfill, not to destroy. So it's possible to say that there is really nothing new in spiritual life. That the highest truth, the highest experience has already been had by human beings for a long, long time ago. And yet we need these different teachers at different points in history to be able to express that truth, to describe it to us, to explain it to us in a language, in an idiom that we can understand. So when Vivekananda comes and teaches something, he's not giving us something new. He is giving the same old, the truth that is as old as anything. It's beginningless. But if he presents it in a way that makes us think today, he expresses it in a language which we can understand. Sometimes you leak a 5,000-year-old text. Sometimes it would be difficult to connect with it because it might use metaphors and symbols and analogies which may have passed by this time, which we need something, someone who can express that same idea in more familiar terms. And that's what these great teachers have done. And that's what is meant by saying, I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. And that is the difference that Swamiji is pointing out here. That Shakyamuni came not to destroy, but he was the fulfillment, the logical conclusion, the logical development of the religion of the Hindus. So we'll pause here now. I would invite you to give your thoughts, comments, impressions, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to discuss them here for you. Yeah.
Swamiji, you talked about meditation, and when I think of meditation, I think often, for me, it's a set amount of time I spend. And when I think of other activities, for example, running is not just time-based, but there's a distance metric. So you can say, oh, I ran 5 miles or 10 miles. And that often is an easier objective than to say I ran 30 minutes or an hour. Yeah. So for meditation, is there any metric other than time that we can use to help us spend more time?
Well, time is a metric not unconnected from the quality of my meditation. So it's just not that if I can just sit motionless for 2 hours, that doesn't necessarily translate into I'm having a good meditation for 2 hours. So now, time is important, yes, but within those 2 hours that I sat, how long was I truly focused on the object of my meditation? And if it was for, say, 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I really was meditating for 15 minutes. I might have been sitting there for 2 hours, but I meditated for 15 minutes. And so time can be a metric only if I am careful to know how much time I was really meditating. It's not just the physical act of sitting in one place. Yeah. Shrikant.
Swamiji, I think currently we, at least when I meditate, we have our object of meditation, like we meditate God or say prayers. What does Buddhists do? Like what
Oh, there are many. There are, in every tradition, there isn't just one way to do it. Even in the Buddhist tradition also, there are different schools, there are different sects, and they have their own special kinds of meditation. So it's difficult to just say, this is Buddhist and this is Hindu. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. And one of the popular ways today, which is often gotten identified with Buddhism, is the Vipassana meditation. But again, that's not the only way, but that's one of the popular meditations today. Many people have found benefit from that one. Okay. Yeah. Giovanni?
Swamiji, the fact that many prophets in the past revealed again and again the same religion, even the same truth, even in the ancient times, doesn't in some way mean that the mankind is still the same? If this message is true now, was true before, like what we are has to be the same, because otherwise how could we understand something that we the point I'm saying, like, we didn't change since then. Like, what is the basis of the mankind, of the human being could be still the same? That was the question. I don't know if it's clear.
Could you rephrase that?
So if the message that of the Buddha and of other prophets that is still true today was true then, like my reflection was that the people to which this message is addressed didn't change. The audience of the Buddha is still
sure.
Is still the same. That was my...
Yeah, that's very true. The message is very valid. But sometimes the language changes. So, pretty much now, most of the teachings we learn are in just translations. Even from most of us, I think, cannot read even the original language in which the scriptures of our own tradition were written. In fact, most of what we do is through translation. So there again, we need a vehicle. We need a familiar language to translate these ancient texts. Because if we are not familiar with the original language in which it was written. But just as the translation is necessary in language, sometimes a translation may be necessary across culture. Translation may be necessary across religious ideals. So all of these translations become necessary. But the message itself doesn't change. That's the idea. Sometimes it's a little bit like, again, I'm just going through this generational divides. People speak about the generation gap. Sometimes a great-grandfather or grandmother might come and tell a grandchild, say, do this or don't do this. But they may put it in words or do it in a style which might be probably the best style 70 years ago, 60 years ago. But the child of now is like, what is this saying? Doesn't make any sense. But maybe the older brother or sister of that child comes and tells the child to do exactly what the grandparents were telling them, but tells it in a way which says, okay, what you say makes sense. Actually, she is not telling anything different. You're just telling it in a language, in a way that the child would understand. So I think that's what really means by I came not to destroy but to fulfill. Yeah. Any other thought? It doesn't have to be a question, even if you have some idea, feel free to say.
So my question is as an outsider, because I have just started to come and attend, so I'm learning. So, and I also attended the puja. So the philosophy of the Vedanta society, as I understand, is Advaita. So it's oneness, right? So there's no difference between I'm part of the whole or I am the whole kind of philosophy. But then I saw that there was a tradition of performing a puja in a very ritualistic way. And I couldn't connect the two together, because if I am that whole and a reflection of the whole, then why do we have to, perform those rituals?
That's a good question. Well, if I'm that whole, I don't need to perform that puja. But do I live my life as if I am that whole? Because simply having just an intellectual notion, only when I'm reading it, oh, I'm that whole, just kind of feels good about it. And then for the rest of immediately, just 2 minutes later, I just rush out. And even when you're crossing the street, you want to make sure you don't want to cross when in the pedestrian crossing, there is a green light. You say, well, the car might come and I might die. But if you are the whole, you shouldn't be afraid, right? And so an intellectual appreciation of a certain idea and the actual experience of that oneness are two different things. So whenever the pujas that we do, the rituals that we do, is a recognition, not a rejection of that idea of oneness, but a recognition that in my present state, if I have to at some point experience that oneness, I must go about doing it in a systematic way. And so the puja and the rituals and the hymns are not seen as an obstacle to experience that oneness. In fact, the puja that we do here was really systematized and constituted by Shankaracharya, who taught about oneness. And so I don't think there's any contradiction. Otherwise, why would Shankaracharya do that? Because he's seen as the philosopher par excellence about non-duality. And so many of these devotional hymns and everything were really written by him. So once we begin to take spiritual life seriously, then we recognize that none of these things are an obstacle. In fact, to look upon ritualistic puja as a dualistic practice itself is a very shows our ignorance about puja itself. Because all of the puja is actually a very non-dualistic thing. Externally, yes, it does look like there is a deity on the altar and I'm making all these offerings. But internally, the mind that is engaged in the act of worship is just seeing oneness there. And so I would encourage you to read Swami Vivekananda's Jnana Yoga to see that an intellectual understanding of an idea and the lived experience, if those two have to come to one, we'll have to do more than simply appreciate that idea. We'll have to actually do something about it.
Swamiji, I really appreciate the metaphor about the inside and the outside of the house, the perspective. And I was thinking about how you could use that in applying that to so many facets of the way you view things in life, whether it's generation gap, an older generation staying curious about a younger generation's view, or even in a work setting, you might be a specialist in a certain area, and the importance of asking people from a different perspective about seeing the whole. And so I think it's helpful to imagine that most of the time you're only seeing the inside of the house in some facet, and
Absolutely.
to invite the outside.
Yeah, that's very true, very true. In fact, there would be so much peace and harmony, not only within us, but among the circles in which we move, among our friends, among the family, among the relatives, and of course in the world itself. If we make an effort to understand everything not only from our perspective, but from the perspective of the person in front of me. And that's what empathy really means. In fact, there is a verse in the Gita, Atmaupamyena sarvatra, means one of the experiences of what is seen as enlightenment in Hinduism means that one begins to see one's self in everybody and everybody in oneself. And what that means is, if I'm in conversation with someone, and even if that someone is saying something with which I totally disagree, and then it's so easy then to say, what you're saying is wrong, what I'm saying is right. I mean, that's what most people do. But if I carefully listen to what that person is saying, and then try to figure out, why is this person saying whatever he or she is saying? Clearly, just as my ideas, my views have been shaped by my understanding, my own studies, my own experiences in life, the person in front of me, their ideas have been shaped by their understanding, their reading, their experiences in life. And their experiences have been different from mine. So no wonder they think about things differently. Furthermore, if I were to be if I would have had exactly the same experiences and the same thing like the person in front of me, maybe I would be saying the same thing also. Now that doesn't mean that, disagreement is still valid, but there would be a greater acceptance rather than sometimes not just disagreeing with people. Sometimes, as they say, it's okay to disagree, but not be disagreeable. Sometimes just because we don't agree with someone, we pass judgment of the person itself. All that can be avoided if I can have a greater sympathy. Think about just this common example, for instance. Let's say that you meet a friend or a neighbor while you're going out in the morning, and your neighbor is there, and you very cheerfully say, "Hey, good morning, how are you?" And the neighbor, who just kind of looks at you and doesn't respond. And then you're offended. So I was so friendly, and I said, and this person didn't. So next time I'm going to meet this person, I'm not going to greet this person. Why should I? And that's the natural human response to it. On the other hand, if I think to myself, maybe this person who is generally very friendly, maybe that didn't have good sleep last night. Or maybe this person is worried about something or stressed out by something. Then I may not exactly know what happened, but if I at least acknowledge the possibility that this person is not necessarily some evil person refusing to greet me back, but there might be some genuine reasons why the person may not have greeted me back, then next time I wouldn't make a resolution like I'm never going to greet that person again. A lot of times, friendships have been lost. People have had bad blood among them, sometimes between families, for generations, for very petty things, wasn't even a big deal. And so if we learn to have a little bit greater understanding, even from a purely utilitarian standpoint, if people say, well, I don't care for the world peace or something like that, if you don't care for world peace, at least for one's own peace, if I want to be peaceful and calm, it's good to have a little bit of a sense of forgiveness and understanding and kindness. Always to think good about other people. That really helps. So anyway, I mention all this to show that this insider-outsider thing also, that when people might have different views, and we are free to disagree with views, but it's always good to listen carefully to what the other person is saying. And it's possible that I might have something to learn from that other person. And if there is something to learn, I should be grateful for the lesson learned. Or it's also possible that the other person is saying total nonsense. Again, I don't have to tell that person, you're talking all rubbish, because just telling someone they're talking rubbish doesn't do you any good. You're just hurting the other person, and nothing useful is achieved. But if there is a way to correct that other person, and doing it in a way that will preserve the dignity of the other person, I think one should do it. You see, a lot of times, what most people want in life is some amount of respect. If we have that kind of understanding and respect for people, they are willing to accept anything that you say. But if we don't respect the other person, if we have a very patronizing, condescending attitude towards them, even if you're telling something good, they won't accept it. So that's and that's what the Gita teaches. Atma upamyena sarvatra. Don't look upon the other person as the other person. Look upon that other person as an extension of your own self. Then actually we will see that it will be very difficult to blame anybody the more we are able to start seeing it. Think about it this way. Sometimes, and I'm sure sometime or the other, it may have probably happened to most of us. Sometimes we might just end up biting our own tongue. Has it happened to you? Now, when we bite our own tongue, who do you blame? There isn't anybody to blame. Just my teeth, this thing, I did it myself. So you just feel bad about it, and then you say, well, I have to be careful. And then you just suffer for some time. But you can't blame anybody because it's just you who did it. But now if someone else were to come and, of course, if someone does it knowingly and maliciously, of course, you have to defend yourself and protect yourself. But let's say, unintentionally, you get hurt by someone. It was not that person's intention, and people still get angry. Why did you do this to me? How could you do this to me? But that time, if you remember about just the fighting, and this person didn't intend to do that. It just, if I don't get angry when I bite my own tongue, then all of these pains that can come to us, oftentimes through the medium of someone else, but it must have been totally unintentional. And am I able to forget and forgive in that? Anyway, it's not easy. We know the philosophical principles underlying what we should do. But that's what spiritual practice is. It's not just about how long I can sit and meditate every day. But this is spiritual life in action. How in my day-to-day, I'm able to hold. And this holding one's peace is important. Because if I'm not able to do it, I won't be able to meditate that day. I might go and sit. But even when I'm sitting with closed eyes, all those thoughts will be still going on in my head. But this person did like that. This happened. That's no meditation. So if I have to meditate well, I need peace. And if I want peace, I have to work at it in every little thing that we do throughout the day. So the success in our meditation in the evening depends on what I do from morning onwards. So in order to meditate well in the evening, the work begins in the morning. In order to meditate well in the morning, the work begins the previous evening. So there is no holiday in spiritual life. At least in all other jobs, you have a weekend. But in spiritual life, usually weekends is more work. At least in Vedanta society, we have more work on weekends than on weekdays. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu. So on Sunday last, we celebrated Ramakrishna's birthday with the puja. So next Sunday, we'll have a reflection on his teaching, the significance of his life. So the subject for next satsang on Sunday will be Ramakrishna's 3 gifts. We'll continue with the study of Swamiji's talks next Wednesday at 7:30. And the meditation on Tuesday and Saturday will also continue as usual. So let's conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto.